policy discussion. How can we secure a ceasefire now? I'm Ryan Costello. I'm policy director with the National Iranian American Council, and I'm happy to be moderating here. So the world has been horrified by the unfolding war in Gaza, where a horrific slaughter has killed more than 33,000 Palestinians since October 7th, and famine threatens many more, including hundreds of thousands of children. These past weeks, we've also seen a dramatic expansion of regional tensions after Israel bombed Iran's diplomatic compounds in Damascus, Syria, sparking an intense rocket and drone attack against Israel just this past weekend. Israel is threatening a response, and Iran is threatening to retaliate further, putting the region at the edge of a disastrous conflict. And also today, many of us in this room participated in, and we've also been inspired by the grassroots movement demanding a ceasefire now. So I wanted to thank everybody here for joining in this discussion and also for your advocacy today. We're going to discuss all this, but first let me introduce our distinguished panel. We have Iman Abid Thompson, is the Director of Advocacy and Organizing at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Prior to joining USNPR, Iman was the Regional Director at ACLU of New York, where he organized for years across New York on issues ranging from immigration, justice, to mass incarceration. John Reming-Chappell is Advocacy and Legal Fellow in the Center for Civilians in Conflict U.S. program, where he engages with U.S. policymakers and advocates to enhance the protection of civilians in conflict. His work focuses on U.S. law and policy related to civilian harm, arms sales, and security assistance. Odelia Matter is a program assistant for Middle East Policy Team with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, working to promote peace and prosperity in the region, reduce violence, and resolve long-lasting conflicts. Odelia grew up in Jerusalem and co-founded Negev Media, an organization promoting representational and solution-based media regarding the Arab-Bedouin struggle for human rights and equality. And we have Sina Azodi, professorial lecturer at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Dr. Azodi's research interests include international security, nuclear nonproliferation, and U.S.-Iran relations. His doctoral dissertation, Iran's nuclear program and struggle for security and modernity, traces the evolution of Iran's nuclear program. All right, let's dive right in. And Iman, we can start with you. We've seen more than 6 months of horror in Gaza following the October 7th attacks. The U.S. has provided Israel with the weapons for its war and shielded it from scrutiny at the United Nations. Would the scale of horror of this conflict have been possible without U.S. support?
Thank you all again for being here, and I appreciate Ryan for the invitation alongside my esteemed colleagues here. I want to acknowledge the fact that at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, our main overall mission has been to address what specific role the United States plays in the occupation of Palestine. And so for us, it's been a main part of our objective for a specific reason, and that's understanding that without United States support, without this additional unwavering support the United States has historically offered to Israel since the rise of the pro-Israeli lobbying firms that have existed here in this country, without it all, we wouldn't be able to see occupation happening to the scale that it's happened unfold over the last 76 years. So when we acknowledge the last 6.5 months, we know that the United States has had an opportunity to withhold aid from Israel, and it's chosen not to. It's, compromised the possibility of conditioning aid to Israel, but it still has yet to do that. And we know that based on this past weekend's developments, we've almost set ourselves back to the point of no return, in the sense that there is little to no budging, both the Biden administration and Congress, on when it comes and what it looks like to send additional funding to Israel. There is this unequivocal, ironclad support that the United States has consistently offered the U.S. So for us, especially myself, I'm Palestinian, I have family in the West Bank. For many of us who have witnessed the walls of occupation over the last few decades, for as long as I've existed, as long as my mother has existed, my grandmother, great-grandmother, we know that it isn't without United States support that this has only been able to be sustained. And so it's why in the last 6.5 months, we've also been so fixated on the role of the US in ensuring that we don't just focus on the Israeli policies and demands, but the regards towards the United States stance and its ability to influence Israeli politics and Israeli policies and viewpoints. It has this kind of like this chokehold over Israel, but it has chosen not to use it by any means. And I think for us, we want to continue focusing in on what specifically the US can do, because we understand that without this unwavering support, there is a possibility that we can actually withdraw ourselves from seeing the escalation continue, not just in places like the West Bank, but as Gaza has unfolded the last 16 months. And so it's been devastating to watch just what the United States has stood by. It's been devastating to see that over 35,000 Palestinians have been killed. Over 13,000 of them are children. And we've seen just how international law has been violated left and right, and yet the US has chosen not to stand against or hold Israel accountable. And so it's deeply devastating. I think, again, for all of us who have understood this issue for a long time, for many of you here who care about this, for many of you who are lobbying on Capitol Hill, you understand that there's a lot that the United States can do, is just choosing not to. And whether we're looking at the Biden administration or the policies that the US Congress is allowed to support, and I think even just today, we saw a number of aid packages being introduced. We originally thought we were dealing with $14 billion that was going to be submitted to Israel, but we are actually now talking about $26 billion. And again, it's being submitted hours before it could potentially be getting passed. We don't even have the opportunity to look into transparently what this money is used for. It includes Iron Dome funding. It includes additional weapons transfer. It includes a number of things. And I think it's just such appalling news, knowing that in this moment where we should be holding this country accountable for what it is doing to the Palestinian people. And if you want to even look at it from the angle of what it's doing to children, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and dehumanize or in any way legitimize what sort of influence it's played on the men and the women and the parents and the grandparents and all of that across Gaza. But I think it's really important to recognize that even when it comes to children, Israel is not doing what's right. So the United States has the opportunity, and it's why I think so many of you are calling on members of Congress to demand this total and permanent ceasefire. I think that if the United States had actually chosen to stand firmly by the decision that the majority of the American public, the majority of American voters actually want to see a ceasefire happen, and the favorability amongst the American public as well to condition aid to Israel has grown over the last couple of months, because I think people have seen just what we have been capable of holding onto and what we've been capable of perpetuating. And yet still Congress and the administration turn the other way and don't necessarily choose to look at it. But it doesn't mean that we can't influence what's happening. So I'll start off with saying all of that. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that. And when we had our lobby meetings today, there were Americans from all walks of life, and they're advocating for a ceasefire, advocating for there's no more blank check to Israel that cease trusted. So, John, there are a lot of laws on the books that could be applied here. We've got the Leahy law. Biden himself has adopted this National Security Memorandum 20. All of these things say effectively, we the United States cannot give military assistance to a foreign country if it's perpetrating war crimes. And everybody has seen their feeds on the news, massive war crimes being committed every day. So, essentially, can you walk us through some of these authorities and explain how the administration has justified not using them?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you everyone for being here, and apologies that we're all together under such unfortunate circumstances. US law is clear. It's clear on a number of counts. The United States can't provide assistance to units, foreign security forces that commit gross violations of human rights. It can't provide weapons to a country that engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. And the United States cannot provide weapons sales to a country that restricts in whole or in part, directly or indirectly, the delivery of US humanitarian assistance. Now, President Biden has reinforced these laws, at least on paper, through his policies, things like the conventional arms transfer policy that came out a little over a year ago and committed that the United States wouldn't transfer weapons, but more likely than not that those weapons would be used in war crimes, and National Security Memorandum 20, which requires all countries that receive US funded weapons to commit to use those weapons in compliance with international law and to facilitate the delivery of US humanitarian aid. But we've seen have an unfathomable degree of obfuscation. We've seen that the Biden administration has taken great lengths to deny what is clear to everyone who is paying any attention, that the level of harm to civilians is unacceptable, that credible organizations around the world have found evidence of likely war crimes and other violations of international law. And so we're at the point now where Biden isn't just doing nothing. Biden is actively making exceptions for Israel, even as the devastation of Gaza continues, even as more than 30,000 people are dead, including more than 10,000 children, and 70,000 have been wounded, and the medical infrastructure has been decimated, and famine is likely already present in many parts of northern Gaza. And so this erodes the ability of the United States to push for human rights anywhere in the world. It sets a clear double standard. It isolates the Biden administration in the international community, including among the allies and partners that President Biden was prioritizing in his messaging when he came into office. And so President Biden could suspend arms transfers to Israel today. He could do that right now. But instead, he's created layers and layers of process to delay what appears to all of us to be the obvious, which is that President Biden needs to use his leverage. President Biden and his administration provides billions of dollars every year in foreign military financing to the government of Israel, has refused to use it, has reiterated that US arms transfers to Israel remains unconditional. And so even in the last few weeks, since the Israeli government provided assurances regarding international law and humanitarian access, we've seen what appear to be violations of those very assurances. And we've seen credible organizations like the International Rescue Committee, a number of humanitarian organizations calling attention to the fact that the assurances that the Israeli government has provided cannot be taken as credible. Some of the things we've seen just in the last few weeks, just since the delivery of assurances, were 3 airstrikes on cars bearing the mark of World Central Kitchen, full of aid workers, in a deconflicted zone. We've seen a devastating siege on a hospital, and recently the reports of the discovery of mass graves there. And we've seen, of course, the attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which appears to be a potential violation of the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations and the Vienna Convention on consular relations. So,
and all of that is after Israel certified that it will use US weaponry in line with international law.
that's absolutely correct. And it's clear that that's not the case, and Congress has to take immediate action to ensure that the Biden administration uses leverage to push for a ceasefire.
Adelia, one of the things that we've often heard from members of Congress, they're maybe uncomfortable with what Israel doing, is they have this, kind of boogeyman and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But, is this just Bibi's war, or is it broader? And, would things look substantially different with another Israeli leader, maybe Benny Gantz or something?
Yeah, so I've noticed that pattern as well, and I think some of us might have seen Chuck Schumer's statements calling for re-election in Israel, which to many was this exciting act of condemnation or applying pressure on the Netanyahu government. I'm the last to say that Netanyahu is not a boogeyman. I think that's a compliment considering. He's been in power for most of my life. He's been in power for about 16 and a half years. And his policy, we say in Hebrew, mediniyut hakipaon. It's the policy of frozen policy, basically keeping the same occupation in place and managing the occupation instead of solving it, has only really facilitated to deteriorate an already brutal occupation, to deteriorate any foundation that there was with Palestinians and Israelis trying to work together to solve this ongoing brutal occupation. Simultaneously, I think it's important to understand what the alternatives actually are to Netanyahu. The alternatives we see today are, I guess, if you are optimistic, if there were re-elections and Benny Gantz was elected, this person is an ex-Israeli major general. He was in that position in the 2014 war and wars that came afterwards. He ran a campaign several years ago in Hebrew, boasting that he had killed more Palestinians than Netanyahu. And that was his, underlying line. That is the populist and actually very successful way to gain Israeli public support if elections were to be called tomorrow. Another alternative would be, and I think that it's important not to undermine this potential, is someone as radical as Ben-Gvir or Smotrich, those extremist right-wing fascist factions currently making up about a fourth of the Israeli government. Netanyahu has allowed them to control so much of the infrastructure of the government itself. Like the national minister of security, Ben-Gvir, recently created a task force that would criminalize activists, some I imagine to be yourselves, who've ever spent any time in the West Bank to try and document or report on violations of human rights and settler violence on Palestinians. Those will be criminalized because they've reported to the United States, which have followed by applying sanctions on violent settlers and outposts. This is a really, really horrific trajectory, but if elections are called tomorrow, I cannot say safely that those people will not find themselves back in the Israeli government. And the reason I'm saying this as well is based on some of my experience working in education for the last several years in Israel. Every year, 18-year-olds that I had been teaching would become more and more radical. And we've had elections over all of the years that I've been teaching a specific course with an organization called the Forum for Regional Thinking. Every single year I carried out a survey and asked my students, who are you going to vote for in these elections? It was anonymous. The first year there were a couple who voted for Ben-Gvir's party, Jewish Power. The next year there were a couple more, and by the fifth year, a fourth of the students in a program that considered itself very liberal voted for Ben-Gvir's party. So I don't think that we can overlook how the Israeli public has been radicalized. I think that US pressure can actually show this public, as well as the government, whichever government is in power, that radicalization, extremism, and dehumanization of Palestinians does not go by without consequence.
Thank you. Sina, let's zoom out a bit to the broader region. Many of us have feared since the October 7th attacks that the war in Gaza could expand into a regional war that would bring in the US, Israel, and Iran. And we got serious confirmation of those fears this month. First, as we've alluded to, the attack by Israel on the diplomatic compounds in Damascus on April 1st. And then over the weekend, the major retaliation from Iran. Can you walk us through, how we got here from the shadow war that had been playing out recently, and exactly what Iran was hoping to achieve with this strike?
Thank you everyone for coming. Ryan, thank you for inviting me. Let me just give you a hypothetical scenario in which the Russian military had launched an attack against the Ukrainian embassy in Berlin, and citing a meeting of Ukrainian military commanders plotting to conduct an operation against the Russian military. And that's exactly what happened, a few days ago, where the Israeli military, Iranians claim it was an F-35 aircraft, attacked the Iranian embassy with killing a bunch of IRGC commanders. Now, they're suggesting that we took out one of the commanders who was involved in the planning and the operation of the October 7th. I don't buy that. Maybe it's true. That's a separate issue. But I think the point is that the Israeli military, using the weapons that we provide them, let's say F-35, attacks a foreign diplomatic mission, kills a bunch of people, and they got away with it. And again, think of it. If the Russians had done the exact same thing, imagine the international outcry, and rightfully so. But why would you attack a protected facility under international law? So this is where we are. Now, for years, Iran and Israel had been fighting each other in the shadows. The Israelis would attack Iranian interests in Iran, in Syria, in Lebanon, and Iranians would respond by attacking Israeli interests on the sea and other places. But there was I suppose, an unwritten or tacit understanding that this war should be kept in the shadows. But the attack on the Iranian embassy violated that understanding. Now, I'm not saying that they had actually agreed on it, but they both stuck to this understanding. But again, as I said, this violated that agreement. The war is no longer in the shadows. You have an Iranian diplomatic facility being attacked by an Israeli or in an Israeli airstrike. This is where we are now. Iranians, and I've been looking at the Iranian internal debate, they were under a lot of pressure to respond, both domestically and let's say externally. Domestically, the arguments that I've seen is people were suggesting, and there are different camps, different political factions. Nowadays, I say ultra-conservatives and conservatives. The ultra-conservatives were suggesting that how long are we going to show strategic patience? That's something that they call it. If we attack, you assassinated one IRGC commander, we didn't do anything. They attacked our nuclear facility, Natanz, a sabotage operation, we didn't do anything. Price of dollar goes up, we didn't do anything. How long are we going to wait? And this is on the Iranian TV. And the guy was suggesting that we have to respond. Then there's also the conservative camp. And one example being, the former speaker of the Iranian parliament, Ali Larijani, who think that this is a trap by the Israelis to drag Iran into an open conflict, something that Netanyahu has been trying to do for decades, since 1990s, as far as I remember. So I guess this gives you a little context of why they did what they did. And externally, they think, or at least my reading of their thinking, is that if they don't respond, their so-called deterrence and credibility is at stake. So they had to respond by showing force. And this is very interesting because this time around, they didn't use their proxy forces. Technically, they would use their proxy forces. And in the past, they have used, Hezbollah, Houthis, and, they would, Houthis would attack, or some group in, Lebanon would attack. But this time around, they decided to risk an open conflict with the Israelis and launched from Iranian soil on the Israeli territory. And they cited their, inherent right of self-defense, the Article 51. That's a, separate issue that you can speak on that. And something that caught my attention, and it gives you again a little context of how much anxiety they are going through. In the past 4 months, Iran has attacked 2 nuclear weapon states. One being Pakistan, in response to a terrorist attack in Iran. Iranians launched missiles in Pakistan, despite all the good relationship that they have. And second, they attacked another nuclear weapon state, being Israel. Again, risking the conflict with Israel and by extension, the United States. But while they did that, they also sent a message, or many messages, through the Turks, through other third parties, to the United States and the Israelis, that we are going to attack. We are not seeking war, but we need to do this. And they did it. Now, the question of what happens next, Ryan and I were talking, as Ambassador Lindbergh would like to say it, it's I don't know, or it's complicated. I hope that the US can exert pressure, the Biden administration can exert some pressure on the Israelis not to respond. I think this is the best outcome for everyone. Right now, Israelis can claim victory. Iranians can claim victory. They hate each other still, but they can go home safe. There are other options. The Israelis could attack Iran's interests outside the country, Iran's proxy groups here and there. Iran's or IRGC's bases in Syria or someplace else. Still, I think a low risk option. But I think the possibility of Israelis attacking inside Iran is extremely dangerous because Iranians have promised that they are going to respond. Now, the question is, if the Israelis respond to the Iranian attack and the Iranians respond to the Israeli response, the question is, what is the Israeli response to the Iranian response because it responds to Israel's response? So, you know, I don't think Israelis want war. I don't think Iranians want war. But I think there's a good chance that they both jump on this escalation matter, and all of a sudden you have a full-fledged war.
So if I could jump in there.
Sorry, I thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems clear like Israel is gearing itself up for some sort of an attack, whether that be outside of Iran or whether it be inside of Iran. We had reports today, you know, Israel contemplated an attack on Iran on Monday and they canceled it. If you're Joe Biden and you see Israel gearing up for an attack and Iran responding and saying, we will attack within seconds, you know, what are you telling him to try to get him to de-escalate the situation?
I think that Biden's messaging is good, but it's not enough. It's weak. Meaning that the Biden administration had sent a message to the Israelis that we will help you in defensive operation, but not offensive operation. But this is not enough. You know, and I'm not a expert on Israel's domestic politics, but I think for years Netanyahu has made a career out of defying American presidents, being Clinton, Obama, now Biden, which has thrown the U.S. support behind the Israelis, but I don't think he will listen. I think that as a prime minister who's facing jail time once his premiership is over, his interests are in staying power. Enjoying the perks of premiership are much better than spending time in jail. So again, I don't know what Biden could do, but his messaging is right, but it's not enough. And to his credit, I don't think in an election year he can let's say leave Israelis on their own. Trump will grill him during the campaign, during the debates. And I think Biden is more concerned with his second term than a potential conflict in the region. Which, by the way, I think we all can agree that it doesn't serve the U.S. interest to have a full-fledged war in the region. But we are where we are. I hope that the Israelis choose the least risky option, but I don't make decisions.
I think one of the things that would really reduce the risk that hopefully we can navigate these next couple of weeks without a major catastrophe, but you've got to wind down the war in Gaza. As long as this war goes on, these tensions are going to keep escalating and it could boil over into this full-fledged war that we want to avoid across the region. Iman, let's turn back to you. Talking about ceasefire, we had this, very brief window, kind of Thanksgiving, end of November. There was a humanitarian pause then, some hostages were released. We heard a lot of talk about a second humanitarian pause, and it was going to be around the new year, then it was the end of January, then it was the start of Ramadan. It never came. We're still there. We don't have a ceasefire. People are still dying. Why has this administration been incapable of getting one?
I mean, it's hard to talk about the situation and the lack of us receiving a permanent total ceasefire without talking about Biden's personal unwavering support for Israel. I mean, this man has built his legacy entirely off of his relationship to people that date back to Golda Meir. He has had relationships with almost every single prime minister in Israel, has been nothing but showing and building his support for Israel over this time for the last 45 years, actually, is one of the largest, recipients of AIPAC, and has actually also, back when he used to be a senator, did a lot of fundraising for AIPAC too. So it's hard to think about his policies without acknowledging his legacy when it comes to his support of Zionism, not just a specific prime minister here or there, but just the construct of Zionism. And so for us to hear President Biden, constantly making these statements over and over again around his unwillingness to stand by the call for a total and permanent ceasefire is not necessarily new. But I think that since we have seen these atrocities escalating to the point of genocide, and for our president to still stand by it without ever even choosing to criticize the government by any extent, I think we saw maybe a possibility very quickly before this attack on Iran happened. And then soon right after that, we saw it again. I call it the needle. Maybe we moved it just a little bit, but it moved right back. It moved right back and even further back behind. To the point that, again, as I mentioned earlier, is the United States and President Biden are all mentioning this ironclad support to Israel yet again. And so for us, it's like the call for a total permanent ceasefire is exactly what the Palestinian people need. We can't even think about the future of tomorrow without asking ourselves, what does it actually look like for the airstrikes to stop? What does it actually look like to give people the opportunity to make sure that they live without the fear of bombardments upon them? And so it remains to be the top demand, but it has become it is a demand that has become, I think it's not said anymore alone. Oftentimes, actually something you'll hear in the last couple of weeks is it's coupled with the conditioning aid to Israel, recognizing that both of them go hand in hand. I don't think we can see a total and permanent ceasefire. We've seen pauses, as you just mentioned, but the pauses are not enough. The pauses are not enough because we know that just, the next day we may possibly see the airstrikes happening again. We may see worse, ground troops may invade, whatever it may happen. And that's why we're calling for the complete and total, this total and permanent ceasefire. It remains to be the top demand. But I think the reality is that cannot be upheld if the United States continues to support in the way that it has. And so we are now trying to have this, trying to move the people, and many of you who are lobbying right now and doing this type of work to also understand that funding goes hand in hand with the policies that we're enacting. I mean, again, President Biden months ago, I want to say, I don't even remember the first time he bypassed Congress's authorization to get arms transfers sent over, and he sent ammunition over. That was one of the first things that he had done. And then soon after that, we saw again a set of arms transfers sent over, again without congressional authorization. And now you have everything sitting in Congress's hand as we speak today, trying to submit additional funding towards Israel. It's just that every avenue and vehicle isn't pointing towards potentially getting us towards a ceasefire, but it doesn't mean that we have to compromise on the demand being made in this moment.
So Delia, one of the things that has happened after October 7th, I think, is sort of a dehumanization of Palestinians, particularly in Israel. How can we overcome this?
Yeah, I think first, that's not new. That's not a post-October 7th issue in Israel, unfortunately. And I say this, these are my people. I love my family. I love my friends who are Israeli, but I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of Israelis have held dehumanizing opinions far before October 7th. And I think the best indication is, again, going back to if Gantz were to win these elections, all these, millions of people who've gone and protested with an Israeli flag in hand, calling out democracy now, when they mean let's have Gantz in power and still not provide voting rights to millions of people whose our government controls their lives. So I want to say that the dehumanization is kind of nothing. I wouldn't call it something that is post October 7th. I will say that I went recently for a visit in early February, and I spoke to a lot of people who would consider themselves more left-leaning Israelis that were not aware of levels of famine, and that at the time it wasn't a US official hadn't yet approved that there are levels of famine in northern Gaza, like Samantha Power of USAID did last week, but there were levels of acute food insecurity, and people were just unaware of that. I think a lot of it has to do with this kind of media blackout. Most Israelis have access. Mainstream Israeli media does not report on Palestinians, does not provide that representation. I'm actually quite fortunate because my parents are English speakers, so I have access to international media, but a lot of Israelis don't. Another way that this media blackout has actually been implemented again by the far right faction of the Israeli government have pushed for this, and Netanyahu has approved banning Al Jazeera, for example. So people do not have access to information and what is happening on the other side. At best, at worst, people will completely deny that these things are even happening. At even worse, kind of like what you'd said, there's a kind of fight between conservative to ultra conservative within Israeli society. Some people will obviously wish death upon the masses and openly declare genocidal intent. That's reflected in both society and in government. I think the government endorsing dehumanizing rhetoric and genocidal intent obviously has pushed people to action, whether it be soldiers in Gaza who are posting in social media, in signal groups and Telegram groups, boasting these war crimes that they've been carrying out, which is absolutely horrific, which provides actual evidence that this is happening. And whether it be soldiers in the West Bank standing idly while settlers carry out what I can't consider anything but a pogrom, identical to things that my great-grandparents had faced in Eastern Europe before World War II and during. So I think the dehumanization is something that started before October 7th, is now completely inflamed. But the reason I'm here today is because I believe in humanity, and I think that there is a way out. It's not, our fate to hate each other to this extent. We've lived through dehumanizing societies and worked our way out of that predicament. We have a lot of work to do before we see that change, but we have to start somewhere.
Yes. John, we have, a famine underway. We had some of the power just last week admit that is the case. There's been a lot of talk about increasing aid into Gaza, but it does not seem like it's sufficient to reverse the famine. So, what more can the Biden administration do there to block this? Do we need a ceasefire? And then, two, just kind of what consequences are there when the U.S. fails to uphold its own law and then allows these atrocities to go forward?
Yeah, thank you. So, start at the simplest. Yes, ceasefire is necessary to alleviate famine in Gaza. It's crystal clear. The only way to begin addressing the levels of food insecurity, famine, and also the preventable disease that comes with that is by stopping the bombing. There are a lot of layers when it comes to restrictions on the delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza. One of them is a fear, both by the people who are lining up to receive food aid, for example, and the folks who are working to deliver it, that they will be killed. Whether that is by bombs or shootings by the Israeli military or other methods. And so that much is clear, and it's clear from the findings of the humanitarian organizations that are still doing the work of trying to feed people under these circumstances. And additionally, the Biden administration has not done everything that it can in order to ensure that humanitarian aid is delivered without restrictions. As I mentioned, there are layers of blockages. Whether it is not opening key land crossings, which is part of what has forced the United States and other international actors to resort to dangerous and inefficient airdrops, and also a maritime corridor. There's also the rejection of key humanitarian goods like water purification tablets or maternity kits, crutches, and in many cases, when even one of these quote unquote dual use items, I think is a very arbitrary and somewhat baseless term, entire trucks are turned back. Then there is the refusal to facilitate deliveries in certain parts of the country, or in certain parts of the Gaza Strip. So, for example, it's been very difficult for anyone to deliver aid in northern Gaza. It is part of the reason that the Palestinians there are some of the first to experience famine conditions. And as I mentioned earlier, US law is very clear on this point. No government that restricts the delivery of US funded humanitarian assistance is eligible to receive US weapons. This is a message that has been repeated by members of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. It's been repeated by dozens of major international organizations. And it is eminently clear from the investigations of media and human rights organizations. And so the Biden administration needs to enforce US law and needs to make a good faith effort to actually assess the facts and then do what the law requires. In their refusal to do so, it's up to Congress. I think Congress has not done enough. There are some folks who are doing some, but more action is needed. And it's only by the United States using the leverage that arms transfers provide that it can really push for a ceasefire and really ensure that humanitarian aid gets to the people who need it.
Thanks. So before we had the outbreak of this current awful war, we had a lot of hype around an expansion of the Abraham Accords, where essentially Biden would continue the normalization deals between Israel and many of its neighbors. In return, you know, the one that Biden was contemplating was with Saudi Arabia. There would be a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, and then this would somehow, some way lead to kind of a Palestinian run state, or, you know, some quasi, you know, two-state solution or something along those lines. I think throughout this war, we've continued to hear indications, even as the killing is going on, that this is the goal of the Biden administration. They're going to send, you know, Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk to Saudi Arabia to try to hash this out. It sounds crazy to me. I just want to open it up to anyone on the panel. Like, what is the Biden administration thinking of this? And is there any % chance that something like that is actually in the cards? Yeah, sure.
I think the key country in the region is Saudi Arabia. And I don't know, I doubt that if, you know, whether Iranians were behind the attack, I don't think so. But if Iranians were in any way involved in this was a master stroke by Iranians that checkmated the Saudis' contacts with the US to normalize relations with the US, with the Israelis. I don't think in any Arab country, I'm not an expert in the Arab world, but, you know, I'll say what I understand. The public opinion would allow any normalization with the Israelis. At the end of the day, 16,000 Arab kids have been killed. It will be extremely difficult for any of these Arab countries, Arab rulers, to say, okay, well, you know, let's, you know, normalize relations with the Israelis. But also, we have to keep in mind that in the Saudi case, the conditions that the Saudis had asked from the United States were from the beginning a no-go. One was a security guarantee that they demanded from the United States. And the only security, I mean, they wanted a security guarantee against whom? Iranians. They don't want security guarantee against, I don't know, Yemen or Turkey or Israel. No, they wanted it for Iranians. And two was the right to enrich uranium on Saudi soil, which the United States, because of Israel, would not agree with. So I think, you know, the whole, you know, process of the Saudis normalizing relations with the Israelis is just set aside for now. Maybe years from now, I don't know. But at this point, I think it will be extremely difficult for any Arab ruler to sit and talk with the Israeli officials at a table. My understanding is it will be a political suicide for them. It won't sit well in the Arab population. But as I always say, in politics, anything can happen. Anything can happen. So, yeah.
And how about the politics in Israel of signing off on the Palestinian state?
That, I think that also, I mean, I don't think the Israelis, look, you know, as many people have already suggested, the two-state solution is a mirage. We have a one-state reality and we have a two-state solution. A two-state solution mirage. I don't think even if the Israeli politics would allow it, it's not feasible. There are settlements that Netanyahu is proud of expanding all the time. And so this Palestinian state, which was supposed to come for us at some point, what is the territory of this state? What are the security arrangements for this Palestinian state? I'm someone who supports it, but there are facts on the ground. And with what's happening in Israel, I don't even think that the Israeli politics would support it. And they've been saying that, well, you know, guess what? Are we going to reward Palestinians because of the Gaza war with a state now? These are some of the things that they've been saying. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm proven wrong. But when I look at the facts, I see a reality that is not right.
Yeah. So I think there are moments in US foreign policy that aren't really confined to the present day. They have these long trail of consequences that can stretch out for generations. And, you know, we saw this with the war in Iraq, and I was in high school when that happened, and I was watching the bombs fall on Iraq and wondering, how could my country be involved in this? And, you know, I think we flash forward to today, and the war in Gaza is one of those moments where it's going to stretch out for a very long time. It's impacting so many people today, and there's going to be a very long trail of consequences for it. So how do we begin to unpack what it means to have this slaughter be carried out with a US stamp of approval?
You asking all of us?
Anyone who can, begin to speak to them.
Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you, I think the recognition that this is going to have devastating long-term consequences is one of the hardest things to actually, like, really just take in and understand. I think when we first saw this all unfold, we were hoping it would be done in a month, if anything. It's right, like, we were hoping it would be done tomorrow. And now we're 195 days, almost 200 days out since the assaults on Gaza began. But I think for many of us, it's not just the 200 days, it's the 200 days and 76 years, right? That as long as occupation on the walls of apartheid stand, I want to continue to repeat this, that we know that Israel will continue feeling emboldened to continue acting this way. And so I can't even tell you what the future of Gaza looks like alone. I think just today we heard Benjamin Netanyahu say, well, we're actually preparing to spend our money on the, on building settlements across the Gaza envelope. So this expansion of the Israeli state in these settlements is part of the plan. We've always known that, and it continues to be a part of that, which actually takes me back to the previous question you asked, is like, can we even think about the Abraham Accords? I haven't even heard anybody mention them in the last 6.5 months, but I don't think we could ever go back to the Abraham Accords. To set false pretenses within these parameters are never actually, we're going to benefit the Palestinian people by any means, are really under, I mean, the Abraham Accords is a Trump era policy, it was already set to fail. And I think it only emboldened Israel enough. It completely removed Palestinians from the equation. And I think we're now dealing with a completely new environment, something so unprecedented within the region itself. And I think for Palestinians, I want to acknowledge that the reason behind why we believe we will never go back to the Abraham Accords is because the future of Palestine should be within the Palestinians themselves to decide, just as any other people who have been oppressed should decide for themselves. And so I acknowledge that, again, I think the Palestinian civil society and all of these other groups are trying to identify that for themselves in this moment. But because we've been caught up in the state of genocide and continuous assault, it's been really difficult to think about the future of the Palestinian people. And so I think that all just remains up in the air, which is why our first and, most prominent priority is to get these airstrikes to stop, to get this invasion to stop. And then to move into the, ensuring that the people who are left in Gaza receive the humanitarian aid that they need. I don't even know if there are any medical facilities left open and sustaining themselves. I mean, just the other day, another mass grave was unfolded in Al-Shifa. And again, we don't even know a fraction of what's been happening in Gaza, let alone to know exactly what the people of Gaza need. But I think we are definitely in this for many, many years. Even after a ceasefire happens, I think that the state of Gaza itself is completely under destruction. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a promised, land for continued Palestinians to live on. It just means that it's going to require additional attention. And I think I want to acknowledge that the latest developments coming out of the attack on, the consulate in Damascus, for us as Palestinians became, okay, let's make sure that the people understand that this is not some sort of standalone issue. This has everything to do with what's been happening in Gaza. And it's our opportunity as a movement to also ensure that we continuously bring the attention back on what's happening in Gaza, because what does potentially unfold across the region, it's something that many Palestinians have already noticed and figured, again, that this just wouldn't be pertaining to the Palestinian region. This would unfold to more, and more people will end up getting harmed, which is why ceasefire isn't just about the Palestinian people. It's about so much more than ensuring that we get the proper.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to what you said earlier about the kind of Abraham Accords as well. From the narrowmost perspective, which is often the perspective I am seeing in congressional offices trying to be remorse for Israeli lives lost over Palestinian lives lost. From the narrowmost perspective, these Abraham Accords were supposed to, quote unquote, bring peace to the region. I think not allowing any real concessions to Palestinians was just another straw on the camel's back that completely obliterated any hope Palestinians had of exiting this, an exit way. And therefore, Israel became, on October 7th, the most dangerous place for Jews in the entire world. And it remains that way today. I think if there is a Saudi-Israel agreement with zero real concessions for Palestinians, we are just going to reach the same destination, which is obliteration of hope. And the best thing for Israeli security actually is when Palestinians have hope that their future is promising, that they have something to lose and a future to look forward to, a future period.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about another angle on the Abraham Accords, which is, as has been mentioned, a continuation of the Trump policy, but one that unfortunately, I think President Biden's top advisors have bought a hook, line, and sinker. This is also going to mean, if this approach continues or goes forward, expediting and pushing through arms sales to repressive governments across the region. We obviously have massive concerns with major arms sales to Saudi Arabia and likely that government's conduct of the campaign in Yemen, which included commission of what human rights organizations have concluded for war crimes. It also is highly concerning that there's legislation proposed in the House Foreign Affairs Committee right now that would expedite arms sales to a host of countries with repressive human rights records on the condition that they normalize relations with Israel. When it comes to the effects of the war in Gaza and the US policy with respect to Israel's war going forward, I've talked a little bit about the damage that this does to US credibility on issues of human rights, international humanitarian law, and the protection of civilians. My organization works in places like Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, and across these settings, we see questions about US credibility and how the United States can be talking about the protection of civilians as a priority as it supports the devastation that we're seeing in Gaza. And it's also going to have reverberating effects for civilians living in Gaza for many, many years to come. When explosive weapons, in this case explosive weapons from the United States, are used in densely populated areas like Gaza, it takes a very long time to recover. And the effects of the war stay with communities in ways that we know are going to last a long time, but in ways that we can't fully predict the full implications of right now. So even if there was a ceasefire today, and there should be, still the decimation of civilian infrastructure, the destruction of major cultural sites, the collapse of educational and medical systems, all of these will continue to inflict harm for years to come.
All right, I think we're gonna leave it there, but thank you so much, and please join me in giving a round of applause.